You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
Welcome back to the e-flux podcast. On this week's episode, Sculpture Center curator Sohrab Mohebbi speaks with artist Christian Nyampeta. Christian's exhibition, École du soir, or The Evening Academy, is on view at Sculpture Center in Long Island City, New York, until December 16th, 2019.
Well, thank you for this opportunity for having us. It's my first podcast, so kind of nervous and excited. So we were going to talk about Christian Nyampeta's project at Sculpture Center called École du soir, or the Evening Academy, that is up for view now. But I guess we're going to use this opportunity to get into some of the ideas that Christian wanted to bring in, and also the notion of, having a project like this in New York right now. But before we get there, I just wanted to say, to have a little bit of context, is that we met a few years ago when Christian was working on another project called How to Live Together. And that was an exhibition that I saw at Costco in Utrecht. It was an experience for me, and I just wanted to bring it up because I didn't know what I'm expecting when I went to see that show. And it was in a little, let's say, storefront that Costco had, I guess, rented for the purpose of that exhibition, or as a project space that they've done other projects too. I'm not exactly sure. But Christian has started this project, and there he used this element of yeast to connect three, let's say, essential items that we use in our everyday life. So, of course, to make bread, so as a form of sustenance and to live by. And there was also soap, and there was also beer, of course. And when I got there, I ate some bread and we cracked some beers, and that's the first time we met. But this notion of how to live together, I think, even though it might not be the title of this show, but I do think has been a kind of an undercurrent of a lot that you've been doing, Christian. So maybe to begin with, I was thinking that you would maybe talk to that notion, especially given the context that you were kind of starting these investigations. And also with this notion of the kind of engage in these moments of conflict and in any given way, the different forms of conflict that we're engaged in. So I was hoping that you would speak to that before we get to the current project.
Yes, so that's true. My name is Christian Nyampeta, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And I think it's actually also my first podcast, although I have done a few radio sessions here and there with radios, which I convene, and sometimes also some actual radio stations, including the Chimurenga Pan-African space station. But so I'm very nervous as well, but also excited. So the project you mentioned at Costco in Utrecht in 2013 emerged out of the indeed ongoing question or inquiry that started when I ambitiously tried to translate a book. At the time, it was not a book, but I tried to transcribe and translate the audio recordings of Roland Barthes at the Collège de France that was delivered in 1977. And they were called How to Live Together. So they were delivered as Comment Vivre Ensemble. And then I entered in a way, the artistic practice through those audio recordings. And they came to me at the time when, in fact, there were also riots in London at the time, the outrage around the killing of Mark Duggan. And so that was in 2011. And so when I started listening to them, as you listen to a radio, at the time it was actually through WFMU, and they had a channel that was broadcasting the entire archive of UbuWeb, which is how every once in a while these recordings will come up. So in them, I think I heard another orientation around the mediation or negotiation of violence that is much older, not so much in terms of age, but in terms of I guess the substance and the foundational dimension of the concepts that were being discussed. And those concepts turned out to be those that the ascetics, and before them all kinds of fugitives, that ended up forming communities, often outside of the larger cities. We're talking about 2,000 years ago, in a way that ended up also engendering the Christian monasticisms. So that was before Christianity. And so my interest was sparked, partially because they offered some kind of grammar, vocabulary, structure that seemed to cheat the hold of the contemporary discourses at the time, that certainly seen from the perspectives of, say, peace and reconciliation or NGO discourses, these other ways of thinking about the community or the society tended to bypass or to go behind in time the dominant discourse. So in a way, to me, it offered a certain kind of mobility. And mobility is, of course, not freedom as such, but a mobility to move across time and to look at other ways of thinking, the communal, the common. And so that's how I ended up working with yeast,
Right.
and with soap. So it had it has that dimension of, indeed, I don't want to use a difficult word, but the palyonymic, something old, like an old name, which then enables to move ahead. So that was how I ended up working on the question of how to live together. And so the exhibition in Utrecht was indeed hardly an exhibition, in a sense that it started already in February, and it had different modes and phases that manifested also in the forms that you saw. And part of the reason why it looked as it did was also in response to the locality of Utrecht, which at the time had the highest concentration of shelters for rejected asylum seekers and shelter for the homeless, which of course are two groups that are actually very antagonistic to each other sometimes because of the scarce of the resources. So they tend to fight among themselves for the few possibilities that they are offered. They also had a number of similar shelters, including those for women. So my space actually also offered shelter, and the difficulty was that I couldn't say that was the case, but actually part of the intervention was to offer. So although the Utrecht had it was very well supported municipally, and it offered a lot of help compared to other cities in the Netherlands at the time. But that also meant that you had a high number of those who needed those facilities. So I felt that part of the intervention was to figure out what could be done concretely, but also maybe poetically in some other ways. Yeah, hence the material.
So these elements were not only one that, let's say, the lovers of art will go and use and also gather, because I think it's also important to mention that Bina Choi, the director of Utrecht, has been doing this really incredible ongoing work of the notion of commons. So a lot of the works were also considering the various forms of community making, the questions of labor and collaboration that has been consistent in that program. So that, I guess, was partially what you were also addressing. But I was not aware, actually, and good that you brought it up, that it had this also double function, that it kind of went beyond the, let's say, boundaries of, let's say, the arts community per se. Great. So I just wanted to bring that up as a context because I think it does carry on in one way or another in some of the projects that you've been doing. And forgive me because I don't remember the title, because you made also several films. And I also wanted to address that as a bridge between that, or to get to the Sculpture Center project, is that you also made a series of, let's say, portraits or conversations with thinkers in Rwanda, including Isaïe Nsengimana, who we're going to get to shortly. But was there, and now that you mentioned this, kind of how Barth also opened up this notion of particular forms of aesthetic knowledge and thinking, was there, do you consider that, let's say, continuation of that project and opening it up in the forms of these films that you made?
Yeah, the films started actually also as a pragmatic solution, so to speak, that at the time in 2012, I was invited by the then supervisor, Jean-Paul Martinon, who works at the Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths in London, where I studied. And we wanted to organize every once in a while there's a public forum that's organized by Goldsmiths, and it's open to the public, and it invites a number of speakers to address a specific theme that sometimes is set up as a year-long or a semester-long or a standalone. And this time, Jean-Paul was organizing the forum of May 2012, and it was called the Fifth Forum. And I was invited by Jean-Paul to think together about what to do with that forum. And so he was working on a book that addressed thinking ethics in the wake of the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi. And so because of that, he was in Rwanda, and he had met Isaïe Nsengimana, a philosopher working there. And so he wanted to invite Isaïe to Goldsmiths, but obviously it was not possible because of the logistics, so no budget, and also very hard to get a visa to come to the UK at the time. And so instead, he had this idea of filming him. Why don't we film him? And then simply project that as a starting, or as his contribution. And so, that's how it went, and it happened. And ever since, I've been deeply interested in that specific format and what it allows. And again, the form of mobility it engenders. And so there is indeed a continuity, because Jean-Paul at the time asked me if I had a question for Isaïe, and I said, how to live together, which is then that same question of Barth, which suddenly travels and goes to Rwanda and acquires a new set of meaning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So maybe we can gradually get to the project at hand, but again, as another tangent, you are involved in, at least to my knowledge, and probably more, 2 other academies, informal, or let's say, maybe rather than informal, I would say DIY, or some, I don't know if even that's the correct term, but self-initiated or group-initiated academies that you've been involved with. To my knowledge, one there was last year in Kigali, I believe. And there was another project that you also been thinking about, and I assume Isaïe was part of, and there is a series of let's say, more of a roaming academies that you've done some before. So maybe before getting to École de Soir at Sculpture Center in New York, you can also maybe speak to your involvement in these kind of extra curricular pedagogical projects,
Yes, there is another roadmap school for art education. That's the project and network that last year in Rwanda staged an international meeting in 2018. And another roadmap school was initiated by the School of the Arts of Zurich. And I was invited to contribute to it through, in fact, the intervention of another artist and researcher, Emma Woluka-Wanambwa. And she perceived a need to convene a group of us that were working in or out or across the African continent around shared desires or notions or feelings around the histories of art and the histories of collectives and the histories of education, art education. And so she initiated in 2015 a cluster of another roadmap school. And so the Africa cluster was born in Kampala at that meeting in July 2015, which then included other colleagues from Johannesburg. So there will be Kedeketla Library. That include members from Wits Art School and one other independent member. And so that will be Puleng, Ra, and David. And then, and there are, of course, always much more than can be named. And there were also colleagues from Lesotho. So that will be the Bare Nere Literary Festival. And then also colleagues from Lubumbashi at Centre d'Art Waza Art Center. And myself, who then convenes the Nyanza Working Group, which organized that meeting in Huye, in Rwanda last year. But also colleagues from Cairo at the Contemporary Image Center. And we're always looking forward to more. In fact, one other group joined from Kinshasa, but the more join, the better, even though that poses limits on the budgets, which are always very minimal. And in fact, we're preparing another meeting for February. So if you find yourself in Johannesburg, please visit. Because there will be a staging of École du Soir in some way, as in evening gatherings or schools or so. In this time specifically cinematic, although I don't know yet. Yeah, so that's another roadmap. So it's really a network that extends over 24 cities across the world that seek to bring into view the shared interests or the possible shared histories in art education, but not only. So my interest has been specifically in the histories cluster. So this network again is organized through the Zurich Art School, and in fact, the last meeting was the last one in this specific configuration. So we're figuring out, not only me, but the colleagues who are really far more gifted than I am in terms of organizing are figuring out what is next. And so far, this 3-year phase of 2015 until 2018 aimed to produce a 3 sets of outcomes. And one is what is called an unchronological timeline, which is a timeline that is both at the level of the entire cluster, but also by including smaller, or not smaller, but more locally oriented timelines. And then the other outcome was this exhibition kit, meaning a thing that you can unfold in space and give you, in a cheap and, again, mobile manner, some kind of overview of the interests or histories or desires, but maybe also even artworks. And then the last one was a learning unit. So items that can be used as learning material, either in a class or in a bar. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that has finished. And then the other school that you mentioned with Isaïe in particular, I call it École doctorale, and that's like a doctoral school. There's a reason why I call these things in French. It's not really to sound fancy, but that's because those I work with tend to speak French. And so they...
it's an insider joke.
Yes. Yeah. And they have... so it's a school that is organized by another school that's located in Rwanda, and it places the mostly PhD candidates who wishes to pursue education without having the means to do so. So imagine you have dependencies at home, or you have work and you can't afford to move away from the home city to another place. So instead, you can stay where you live, and you're placed in a university locally where you live, which is then paired with another university, either of your choosing or depending on the studies you want to pursue. And so when you graduate, you have 2 accreditations, and the meetings or the ways of education usually happen online. And then every month or so, there is a collective presentation that takes place in one of the universities. So you then travel for a weekend to present and to learn from fellows.
Well, now that we're on the topic of schools, it brings up to the École de Soir, the Evening Academy, which is a project that you have going on right now at the Sculpture Center. So, of course, since we met in Utrecht, we had a number of conversations in different places. And in particular, I remember one in the mountains outside of Gwangju, where Maria Lind had and Bina Choi had gathered a bunch of people from around the world. And one of the topics that I think, or maybe that's my interpretation of our conversation, it might not be the way that you also formulate it, but I can speak to how I kind of was thinking about the kind of really the significance of this project that you're doing. Well, of course, other than the notion of academy and the knowledge that you're producing or contributing to this project of knowledge production, something that I've also noticed is the form of, let's say, a certain Euro-American academic imperialism and the kind of, let's say, epistemic violence that it maintains. And by that, in particular, I wanted to, in our discussion, we talked a lot about not that necessarily there's a gap between, let's say, homegrown knowledges and the way that the Western academia, let's say, processes these. But there's also the fact that the gap is not pointed to as such. So it will become, let's say, consumed in ways that I feel, again, does not really acknowledge or metabolize these homegrown knowledges. So part of the project, at least in the way that we've been discussing, has been to kind of, sustain this translation project that you've been doing. So that notion of academy, part of it was, I guess, responding to this urgent task of introducing and working through and the interpretation of the forms of knowledge that is not necessarily absorbed readily for various reasons, including historical and epistemic ruptures that does not allow for these forms of, let's say, knowing or desired communities to let's say, exist or coexist across the world. So with this project, you decided or you proposed the notion of creating the working group that is something that you have worked. Again, I wanted to say that you have worked with working groups before. So in this particular case, however, you're we decided to propose this notion of the evening academy or the École du soir, and also work with, in particular, on translation of the work of Isaïe Nzeyimana, a philosopher who you have interviewed before, as you mentioned. And also, we're really fortunate that Isaïe will also join us here in New York. And he will also join the working group, but also he will give a conversation or a discussion here. He will lead a discussion here at e-flux on the 30th of October. So, sorry? 23rd. Sorry. But just to maybe go back to the project, can you talk about École du soir and where it came from, and maybe then introduce briefly the work of Isaïe? I know we're trying to pack a lot into the time that we have, but I was hoping.
Yeah, so very briefly, the project indeed attempts to make sense of the work of Isaïe Nzeyimana, who has been writing for a number of years now, in a way that I believe is singular, because despite the large literature that exists on the subject of the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi that occurred in 1994, there are very few reflections that are not attempting to narrate as it's been done so far. And what I mean by it is that in my literature review, I've actually only found maybe one volume that could be characterized as, again, I'm very hesitant to use the term, but in the disciplinary category, say, of philosophy. I think everything, of course, is philosophy. I don't have much distinction. I'm not qualified to have distinction between, say, theory or philosophy. But from the little I know thereof, there is this book that I mentioned that was written at the time in 2000. It was published in 2013 by Jean-Paul Martineau, an American-French philosopher. And he's much more than a philosopher, so maybe he would dislike me for saying that he's a philosopher. But otherwise, I only know of Isaïe's work, except that Isaïe's work is written in French, which means there is not much. So it's not only written in French, but it's actually not really published. It's published mostly in small editions and with online publishers. So at the same time, I feel that there's an urgency to rethink through what that event actually means on a global scale, because I do believe that it's a global event that announces indeed a rupture in terms of knowledge as well, and how knowledge is made and disseminated. And that particular rupture is, to my knowledge or to my understanding, also an occasion to rethink and to propose new understanding of that same rupture. So that the best way of going about it, I could describe what that specific rupture is, but instead I would like to describe the working method, and maybe that also qualifies as a description. Which is, as you mentioned, the working group. And what this allows is that this text of Isaïe that we are attempting to translate, if it's translated or annotated by a group, it already imbues it with a multiple set of readings that add to the library of propositions that the text itself is attempting to do. So it avoids monumentalizing as a solution to the question of living together, but instead it offers a reading that arrives from a variety of backgrounds and interests, in fact, none of which is singularly philosophical. So instead, it's an attempt to move away or to make philosophy do something else than what it's supposed to do, but to enable an understanding of it that is not any longer disciplinary. So that's, I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Well, I guess for those who really like to learn more about Isai's project, I mean, including myself, I haven't, obviously, I don't know much about his work except for through your previous projects. I mean, they can come or hopefully listen to the live recording of his presentation at e-flux. I know that it's potentially hard to summarize and pack it up in sound bites, but maybe you can speak a little bit to his interest in, let's say, certain forms of aesthetic thinking on the one hand, and then certain kind of forms of, mutated parts of the canon of philosophy that he has been then processing. As far as I know in our previous conversation, if you would like to speak to that, or otherwise, we can also not attempt to summarize his work in these ways.
No, it makes sense. It's only fair to. One soundbite perhaps would be to say something like, he's been thinking through I started talking about old names, and one of the old names that he's been working with is called Ubuvandimge, which means from the same womb. And it's a powerful term, I believe. It's not entirely clear what that womb is and who's the carrier. But essentially, he's trying to say that there's a sharedness, and that sharedness is in itself, in fact, can be the basis of conflict itself. And to the extent that the way he formulates it is to say only those who have something in common can engage in conflict. And it sounds obvious, but when you scale it up and at the, say, level of a genocide, this formulation starts to have a whole different meaning. And so I've worked on this question for a while, through taking it a bit further and seeing what that actually would mean in terms of, again, the community or commonality. So for him, he arrives at this because he sees within the political history of Rwanda a number of indications that indeed suggest that whoever found themselves in the region or in the earth of what Rwanda is seen as the world is a fellow person from the same womb, essentially. So that which divides is also the promise for any possible resolution of that conflict. Yes, so some of his influences are obvious in the sense that most philosophers, if not all intellectuals in Rwanda, were formed in seminaries and monasteries and convents. So, like everyone else, he would have studied the Christian theologies and then also philosophy. So you can imagine the kind of influences he has. My reading of it is that, of course, I find that very paradoxical, but at the same time, it can be seen as or understood as a language which enables to formulate one's own ideas that are not retained within the canon that he studied. So that's my reading of it, and which is why it also makes sense to work cooperatively or collectively on such texts.
I just wanted to briefly add that your project at Sculpture Center also includes a number of hosting structures, some that you have made before and some you've made new for this. And this is also something that you've been engaging with. And these are, let's say, structures that enable forms of thinking together and being together in spaces. So that also is occupying the lobby of Sculpture Center, which is not too distinct from the lobby, the kind of inhospitable lobbies of a lot of, let's say, modernist art primarily, let's say, art spaces, which I think that's something that we've all talked about a lot, and I feel like it has completely added a different dimension to that space and has turned it into a communal space to the extent that people use it. There, we also have a number of previous projects that you've done, some translations, some otherwise. And also, we do have in the outside, in the, let's say, the backyard of the Sculpture Center, you also are showing a shed, which also contains a timeline of education or a pedagogical timeline of yourself in Rwanda, but also how it kind of, let's say, coincides with the form of primarily, let's say, colonial education that's been implemented there. So you also wanted to bring that in terms of, as you're proposing the École du Soir, another academy there, you also are showing a kind of like a trajectory of a different academy that you've been involved in. So I just wanted to point that out as well. So whoever comes by, they can also see these structures and also engage with the previous material that you have also produced. And in the end, I also wanted to add that we also will hopefully add to these previous publications with the work of the working group that is now working with you and Isai. There is a lot to talk about, and we can discuss further, but I just wanted to bring this up, and if there's something you would like to add to that, maybe.
Well, I would love to thank you. I would like to thank you all for listening and for asking such pointed questions that take me back in time and make me reflect. And I also hope that whoever's listening gets a chance to come and visit and interact in some ways, and perhaps also attend the event that either is happening on the day this is published or soon after.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Christian, and thank you. Well, we don't really have time to get into Kojo, but I thought there's this brilliant text that he wrote for Mark Fisher. I can just read that as a way to kind of maybe wrap it up, or in the edit, you guys could cut it out. But I just wanted to bring this up because of your interest in bringing people together, either how to live together, and this question of togetherness that you have sustained in your practice through your both the academy, notion of the academy, but also the structures that you build, the hosting structures, and this interest. So
I think it's good to bring him up because, as I mentioned, he has been my supervisor for the studies that I've managed to complete recently at Goldsmiths. And in fact, the name, the old name of École du Soir came to me, or I was reminded of École du Soir through speaking to Kojo Eshun when he had just returned from Dakar, where he was invited by Antone Njabe of Chimurenga. So it does make sense to bring them.
To bring them up. And I recently saw a work by Tony Coates where Tony is using the text that Kojo wrote for his Mark Fisher Memorial Lecture. And he speaks to Fisher's interest in these various forms of communities, intellectual communities in particular. And he talked about his work as this form of, I'm just quoting Kojo via Tony Coates. He says that his work, or Fisher's work, came from this notion of a certain kind of, let's say, permanent persuasion of gathering people into gatherings, the self-sustaining work of sustaining scenes. He loved when he was able to mobilize what we could call inexactly the craft of making, what we imprecisely call movements, the art of building scenes, the design of sustaining subcultures. So I thought this this notion of this art of this and the craft of making scenes and creating these, let's say, thinking communities and how they can sort of eventually, hopefully, participate in kind of a certain kind of cultural upheaval that I feel is becoming more and more necessary and urgent. And I feel like your work speaks to that.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I know we're way past the mark, but it makes a sense. It makes a lot of sense to hear the cultural upheaval. It's a terrifying but also a promising term, and indeed, my interest in the term philosophy, which I don't really know what it means, and I wish I had another way of saying what I mean by it, but it's partially to do with precisely the end of a certain kind of thinking that was signified by the eruption of the Rwandan genocide, hence the interest in Nzeyimana in the first place.
Thank you.